David Malpass started there talking about the inequality of the recession, but there's also the inequality of the recovery, and this K-shaped recovery we've been talking about for a while now, where one subset is doing fairly well, the other is lagging far behind. How wide does that K get? Are we looking at a longer-term, more exacerbated divergence between the haves and have-nots coming out of this?
Well, we hope not, but that's certainly been the pattern up till now, for sure. So you see it domestically because the sectors that are struggling to come back are the ones where people in the lower part of the income distribution work, who have lost their jobs or been furloughed and so on. Now, we hope that gets reversed at some point, but this is, at least domestically in a wide range of economies, has been an adverse shock. You can say the same thing about the developing countries. And David is right. It's hit the developing countries harder because their balance sheets are thinner and more fragile, so their economic resilience is lower for much of the population, and their medical capacity is lower too. So they have been facing much starker choices between, livelihood on the one hand and controlling the virus on the other, and they're being forced to open up the economy with the virus not completely out of control. So both domestically and internationally, thus far, it's been an adverse distributional event, and both governments and the international institutions are trying, to some extent. Well, they're trying very hard, but they're and I think hopefully succeeding in buffering at least buffering the shock, and maybe even making it less in terms of magnitude. Longer term, I think it's too soon to tell, but there will be longer term damage for sure.
Michael, Boris Johnson, the British Prime Minister, is just on his feet in the House of Commons here in the UK. The debate that is taking place here in the UK and elsewhere is about when you shift from preserving jobs to making the decision that some of those jobs aren't going to come back and allowing the economy to pivot and providing training to allow those that have lost their jobs to retrain. When do you think you make that decision? Is it still too early?
It's a very good question, and I'm not surprised they're debating it. And it's a hard question to answer precisely. But if forced to, I would say it's a little too early. We need to make some more progress in getting the virus under control before we start letting the economy's structural adjustments just occur. So I think another round of support coming from the Treasury in the UK and from the United States government and other governments would be a wise move. It's true, you might preserve some jobs that are ultimately going to disappear, and maybe that's a bit of a waste, but I think it's a risk worth taking.
Well, Michael, you mentioned stimulus potentially coming out of the U.S. It's not looking likely, at least not before the presidential election, maybe not even until January when there is a change or a second Trump administration. What would the impact be of delaying another package 3 months?
Again, it's hard to be very precise about that. So, I mean, it looks like a fairly large number of jobs in very hard-hit sectors, like the airline sector, would be lost. They may not be lost permanently, but that would do some serious damage and certainly slow down the recovery. I mean, I think there's very little question about that. Now, if it looks like it's just a delay, and then we'll get some support coming later, then you get a slightly different conclusion. I mean, then some of these entities might say, well, we've got the financial capacity to stick it out until, say, December. And then you might lose fewer jobs. But on the whole, I think, a significant delay surrounded by uncertainty, which is where we are now, about the magnitude and even if we get a package, is a negative, an additional negative shock.
On the monetary side of the fence, Michael, the tolerance for above average inflation is clear. The question is, how do we get to that above-average inflation? And I'm wondering, as you, a sort of labour market economist, look at the world right now, what role labor can play in getting inflation higher, getting wages higher. Do you see that happening? How do we allow that kind of reassertion of labor to take place, particularly in a world post-COVID where labor has taken such a beating as a result of the virus?
Yeah, I mean, using sort of conventional thinking, it's very hard to see how you get inflationary pressures in an economy that has undergone a contraction of the magnitude that most of our economies have and has such excess capacity, whether it's in the labor market or just by sector. So I think, the way you would get some inflation would be a set of policies coming from government, that say, well, part of our strategy here is to pay people more. It'll be controversial, minimum wages, things like that. But you could generate a little inflationary pressure. But I think, a fair reading of the last 10 years since the great financial crisis is that it's not clear that central banks operating by themselves have tools that are very effective in generating inflation.
And how much tools do the central banks have in terms of, if we do not get another fiscal stimulus, what more can the Fed do? What more could really any central bank around the world do in absence of fiscal policy? Because there's only so much monetary policy can influence the everyday American.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, in the great financial crisis, they were terribly important at the start. Because we had sort of liquidity problems and lockups and damaged assets and so on. We all know that. In this case, as David Malpass said, the origin of the problem is just different, right? I mean, we shut down sectors, people are risk averse and they don't go do certain things. And there's not much a central bank can do about that.